On a grey June afternoon in 1906, along the River Clyde in Scotland, tens of thousands of spectators pressed against barriers to witness something extraordinary. They had come to see the future, a leviathan of steel and rivets that represented the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. As the champagne bottle shattered against her bow and she slid down the ways into the water, the crowd erupted. This was RMS Lusitania, and she was more than a ship. She was a statement. But standing there among the cheering masses, not one person could have imagined that this magnificent vessel, this triumph of engineering and symbol of British maritime supremacy, would become one of the most controversial tragedies of the 20th century. That less than 9 years later, she would rest in pieces on the seabed off the Irish coast, taking with her 1,198 souls and helping to reshape the course of world history. The Lusitania's story is the story of a world that thought it understood the rules, only to discover that everything had changed. She sailed through the confident twilight of the Edwardian age and into the brutal dawn of modern warfare. Her sinking on May 7, 1915, was more than a maritime disaster. It was the moment when civilians discovered they were now combatants, when technology's promise revealed its terrible vulnerability, and when the certainties of the old world sank beneath the waves forever. To understand why the Lusitania existed at all, we must understand the world that created her, a world of fierce national rivalries, imperial ambitions, and technological revolution. By the early 1900s, Britain's domination of the seas faced its first serious challenge in a century. Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany was building not just a navy, but an identity. The Germans had unified their nation through war, industrialized with remarkable speed, and now sought what they called their place in the sun. A powerful fleet was central to these ambitions, and the Anglo-German naval arms race became the defining rivalry of the pre-war era. But this competition played out not only in the construction of battleships and dreadnoughts. The transatlantic passenger trade had become a matter of national prestige, and here too Germany was winning. The German lines, particularly Hamburg-Amerika and Norddeutsche Lloyd, had seized the blue ribbon, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Their ships, the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse and Deutschland, were not only fast but luxurious, attracting wealthy passengers and emigrants alike. For an island nation whose identity was inseparable from maritime supremacy, this was intolerable. Britain's response came through the Cunard Line, founded in 1839 and by 1904 facing serious financial difficulties. The British government, alarmed by German dominance, offered Cunard an unprecedented deal, a £2.6 million loan at exceptionally favourable terms, plus an annual subsidy of £75,000 per ship for 20 years. In exchange, Cunard would build 2 superliners that would reclaim the blue ribbon and restore British prestige. There was also a strategic calculation. In wartime, these ships could be converted into armed merchant cruisers, adding to the Royal Navy's strength. The contract specified that these vessels must be capable of maintaining 24-25 knots in moderate weather, faster than any passenger ship afloat. They would be the largest, swiftest, and most luxurious liners ever constructed. The 2 ships would be sisters, though not quite twins, Lusitania and Mauretania, named for Roman provinces in North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, exotic names for ships that would embody Britain's technological and industrial might. This was more than commerce. It was about demonstrating to the world, and particularly to Germany, that Britannia still ruled the waves. The irony, of course, is that in building these floating palaces partly for potential military use, Britain helped create a target that would blur the lines between civilian and military assets in ways no one fully anticipated. The contract for Lusitania went to John Brown and Company of Clydebank, Scotland, one of Britain's premier shipyards. What they were asked to achieve bordered on the impossible, a ship that would be both the largest and the fastest ever built. Previous record holders had achieved size or speed, never both simultaneously. The engineering challenges were immense. To reach the required 25 knots, Lusitania would need approximately 76,000 horsepower, power that would come from 4 Parsons direct-drive steam turbines, a revolutionary technology that had only recently been adapted for marine use. These turbines, fed by 25 coal-fired boilers, would drive four massive propellers, a quadruple-screw arrangement that was itself innovative for a passenger ship of this size. The hull, at 787 feet in length and 87 feet in beam, was constructed with longitudinal framing rather than the traditional transverse method, providing greater strength while reducing weight. Her gross tonnage would reach 31,550 tons, but size created problems. A ship this large moving at such speeds generated enormous stresses on the structure. The engineers had to design a hull that could withstand both the immense vibration from the turbines and the hydrodynamic forces of cutting through the Atlantic at unprecedented velocity. The construction itself was a spectacle. Over 2 years, thousands of workers labored in the Clydebank yard. Riveters worked in deafening teams, heating rivets cherry red in portable forges, then driving them through steel plates with pneumatic hammers. The noise was overwhelming, the work dangerous. Industrial accidents were common, though rarely recorded in the triumphant accounts of the ship's construction. These men were building a symbol of empire, but they were also ordinary workers earning wages, and some paid with their lives or their health. When Lusitania was launched on June 7, 1906, she slid into the Clyde incomplete, a massive hull that would spend another 15 months being fitted out. The interiors would be nothing short of palatial. The first-class dining saloon, rising 2 decks in height, featured a circular balcony and was designed in the style of Louis XVI, with elaborate plasterwork and gilt detailing. The first-class lounge was decorated in Georgian style, with mahogany paneling and an ornate plaster ceiling. Second-class passengers enjoyed accommodations equivalent to first class on many other ships, while even third class, designed for emigrants, was comfortable by the standards of the day. Modern conveniences included electric lighting throughout, electric elevators serving the first-class areas, and even a system for communicating with the engine room, a precursor to modern ship-to-ship communication systems. Cunard was creating not just a means of transportation, but a floating representation of Edwardian civilization at its zenith, ordered, hierarchical, technologically advanced, and supremely confident. On September 7, 1907, Lusitania departed Liverpool on her maiden voyage to New York. Despite some mechanical teething problems, she was an immediate sensation. Within a year, she captured the Blue Riband, crossing from Ireland to New York in 4 days, 19 hours and 52 minutes, averaging 23.99 knots. Her sister Mauretania would later take the record and hold it for over 20 years, but Lusitania had achieved her purpose. Britain had reclaimed its position at the forefront of maritime technology. For 7 years, from 1907 to 1914, Lusitania maintained regular transatlantic service. She became familiar to thousands of passengers, millionaires traveling in first-class luxury, middle-class families making business or pleasure trips in second class, and emigrants in steerage heading for new lives in America. The crew, numbering around 850, developed routines and relationships. Captains' dinners, ships' concerts, deck games, and the endless rhythm of arrival and departure became the pattern of their lives. But beneath the surface, tensions were building across Europe. Naval budgets soared, alliances hardened. The world that had created the Lusitania, confident, progressive, interconnected through commerce and technology, was more fragile than anyone realized. August 1914 shattered everything. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28 triggered a cascade of diplomatic failures, mobilizations, and ultimatums. By early August, Europe's great powers were at war. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, and overnight, the rules governing transatlantic travel changed completely. The German U-boat, Unterseeboot, or submarine, was initially considered a relatively minor naval weapon. Traditional naval warfare revolved around battleships engaging in gun duels, protected by destroyers and cruisers. Submarines were seen as useful for coastal defense and reconnaissance. But limited by their slow speed, small size, and restricted operational range. International law, codified in various agreements, including the Cruiser Rules, established by the London Declaration of 1909, required that merchant vessels could only be attacked after warning and ensuring the crew's safety. But war has a way of eroding legal niceties, particularly when nations face existential threats. Britain, with the world's most powerful navy, immediately imposed a naval blockade on Germany, aiming to strangle the German economy and war effort by preventing imports of food and raw materials. This blockade, while effective, caused genuine hardship among German civilians and was itself of questionable legality under international law. Germany's response was asymmetric warfare. Unable to challenge the Royal Navy in conventional surface combat, Germany would use submarines to target Britain's maritime commerce. On February 4, 1915, Germany declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone. Any Allied merchant vessel found in these waters would be sunk without warning. Even neutral ships were at risk if they entered the zone, as Germany claimed they might be disguised British vessels. This declaration transformed the Atlantic into a hunting ground. Suddenly, civilian passenger ships sailing routes they had traveled safely for decades faced a deadly new threat. And yet, transatlantic service continued. Commerce demanded it, passenger demand remained, and there was a widespread belief, particularly among the British, that Germany wouldn't dare sink a large passenger liner filled with civilians, including neutrals from countries like the United States. This belief was naive, though understandable. The old rules of warfare assumed a distinction between combatants and civilians, between military and merchant vessels. But 20th century total war recognized no such boundaries. When nations mobilized their entire economies for war production, when merchant ships carried munitions alongside passengers, when civilians manufactured shells and uniforms, where exactly was the line? For the Lusitania, these questions were more than philosophical. In her cargo holds on various voyages during the war, she carried materials classified as non-military but useful to the war effort. And on her final voyage, she would carry ammunition, small arms cartridges and shell casings, legally permitted for civilian ships under both British and American law, but categorically munitions nonetheless. Whether this made her a legitimate military target remains historically contentious, a debate that continues over a century later. Through late 1914 and early 1915, Lusitania continued her transatlantic runs, though under changed circumstances. Her passenger capacity was reduced. Some sections of the ship were closed to save on crew costs. The luxurious peacetime experience gave way to something more utilitarian. The war was distant for passengers boarding in New York, but as they approached British waters, the atmosphere changed. Lifeboats were swung out on their davits for quick launching. Lookouts were posted, portholes were darkened at night. Captain William Thomas Turner, who took command of Lusitania in March 1915, was an experienced merchant mariner, known as Bowler Bill for his habit of wearing a bowler hat ashore. At 58, he had spent his entire adult life at sea and risen through Cunard's ranks based on competence rather than social connections. He was regarded as somewhat taciturn, not given to socializing with passengers, but thoroughly professional. He understood the risks of wartime sailing, but he also trusted in the ship's speed. At 21 knots, Lusitania was faster than any submarine of the era. In April 1915, as Lusitania prepared for another eastbound crossing, the German embassy in Washington took out newspaper advertisements warning Americans against sailing on British ships. The warning appeared in several New York newspapers on April 22nd, adjacent to Cunard's advertisement for Lusitania's May 1st departure. It read, "Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." The warning was clear, even blunt, and yet, of the 1,959 passengers and crew who would board Lusitania on May 1st, 1915, very few cancelled their bookings because of it. May 1st, 1915 dawned clear and bright in New York City. At Cunard's Pier 54 in Manhattan, passengers arrived by taxi and private automobile, porters handling steamer trunks, families embracing on the dock. Despite the German warning, Lusitania was carrying a respectable 1,257 passengers, roughly two-thirds capacity, plus a crew of 702. Among the first-class passengers were individuals whose names meant something in 1915 America. Alfred Vanderbilt, one of the wealthiest men in the world, was traveling to London for a meeting of the International Horse Breeders Association. Elbert Hubbard, a prominent writer and philosopher, was making the journey with his wife Alice. Hubbard was famous for his essay, A Message to Garcia, and was something of a celebrity intellectual. Charles Frohman, the theatrical producer who had helped launch the careers of countless Broadway stars, was heading to London on business. In second class were middle-class families, businessmen, teachers, and professionals. And in third class, as always, were emigrants, many of them now returning to Britain to join the war effort or to be with family. These passengers reflected the social stratification of Edwardian society, separated by bulkheads and deck access as surely as by wealth and status, yet all bound together by their choice to make this particular crossing. Also aboard were parents with children. Over 100 children under the age of 16 would make this voyage. The youngest passengers included infants just months old. For these families, the calculation was simple. Lusitania was fast, considered safe, and life demanded movement even in wartime. The cargo manifests revealed a ship carrying commercial goods, furs, foodstuffs, lace, machinery, copper, cheese, and yes, munitions. In her holds were 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges, .303 caliber, totaling 1,250,000 rounds, 1,250 cases of empty shell casings, and 18 cases of percussion fuses. This cargo was legal under both American and British law. Ammunition was classified differently from explosives like gunpowder or high-explosive shells, which were prohibited. The manifest was public, filed with U.S. Customs. This was not a secret shipment. Whether this made Lusitania a legitimate target is a question of perspective and law. Under the cruiser rules, even if she was carrying munitions, she should have been stopped, searched, and only sunk after passengers and crew were evacuated. Under Germany's declared policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, any British vessel in the war zone was fair game. The gap between these two positions was unbridgeable, and ordinary passengers were caught in that gap. Captain Turner received Admiralty instructions as he prepared to depart. These were standard wartime communications: maintain maximum speed in submarine zones, zigzag in areas of known submarine activity, avoid headlands where U-boats might lurk, and receive wireless updates on submarine sightings. What he did not receive was a naval escort, not unusual, as destroyers and other escort vessels were in short supply and generally reserved for military convoys. At noon on May 1st, Lusitania cast off her lines and moved into the Hudson River, assisted by tugboats. Her four massive propellers churned the water, and she headed for the open Atlantic. The crossing was uneventful for the first 5 days: calm seas, pleasant weather, the routines of shipboard life reasserting themselves. Passengers dined, played cards, attended concerts, and walked the decks. Children ran and played. The war seemed very far away. But as Lusitania approached Irish waters on May 6th, tension increased. Turner received wireless messages from the Admiralty warning of submarine activity along the Irish coast. These messages were somewhat vague, providing information about sightings and attacks, but not precise coordinates or current locations. Turner took standard precautions. He ordered the swinging out of lifeboats, posted extra lookouts, and directed that portholes be closed and watertight doors kept ready for closure. One decision he did not make was to zigzag. The sea was hazy, visibility was somewhat reduced, and he wanted to maintain maximum speed. He was due to arrive at Liverpool on May 8th and needed to cross the tricky Mersey Bar at high tide. Zigzagging would slow his progress. This decision would haunt his reputation for decades. What Captain Turner didn't know was that the German submarine U-20, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, was patrolling off the southern Irish coast, and both ship and submarine were now converging on the same point. Walter Schweiger was 30 years old in May 1915, a career officer in the Imperial German Navy's submarine service. Born into a middle-class Prussian family, he had joined the Navy at 19 and proven himself a capable, ambitious officer. He commanded U-20, a Type U-19 submarine, 209 feet long, displacing 650 tons surfaced, with a crew of 4 officers and 31 men. Life aboard a U-boat was claustrophobic and dangerous. The interior stank of diesel fuel, unwashed men, and the ocean itself. The crew lived among torpedoes, batteries, and machinery. When submerged, the air grew foul within hours. Surfacing to recharge batteries and refresh, the air exposed them to attack. Every patrol was a calculated risk. U-20 had departed Emden on April 30th on a mission to harass British shipping off the southwestern Irish coast. The submarine had already sunk 3 ships during this patrol, the schooners Earl of Latham and Candidate, and the small passenger steamer Centurion. These were standard commerce raiding operations: attack, sink, move on. Schweiger was following orders, executing Germany's declared policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. By the morning of May 7th, U-20 was off the Old Head of Kinsale, a prominent headland on the Irish coast, about 15 miles from the port of Queenstown, now Cobb. Schweiger had actually begun his return to base. He had only 3 torpedoes remaining and was conserving fuel. The weather had turned foggy overnight, and he had submerged to wait for conditions to improve. At approximately 1:20 p.m., the fog lifted. Through his periscope, Schweiger saw smoke on the horizon. He maneuvered toward it, and as the vessel came into view, he recognized something significant: a large passenger liner, 4 funnels, heading eastward along the coast. He didn't initially identify the ship as Lusitania, but he recognized it as a major target. His war diary records his thought process with clinical detachment. This was a large enemy vessel, unescorted, sailing in the declared war zone. Under his orders, it was a legitimate target. Whether it was carrying munitions or merely civilians was irrelevant to his mission. It was British, it was in the war zone, and he had the means to attack it. What happened next unfolded with terrible precision. Schweiger positioned U-20 for an attack, calculating course and speed. Lusitania was approximately 700 meters away, moving at what he estimated at 22 knots. He ordered a single torpedo, a G-type torpedo, carrying 160 pounds of high explosive, loaded and prepared. At 2:10 p.m., Schweiger gave the order, fire. The torpedo struck Lusitania on the starboard side, just behind the bridge, below the waterline. The explosion was thunderous. Passengers and crew throughout the ship felt the impact, heard the detonation, saw water and debris flung into the air. But something else happened, something unexpected. Almost immediately after the torpedo strike, a second, larger explosion occurred from inside the ship. This internal explosion was devastating. It blew out the starboard side in several locations, shattered bulkheads, and sent a column of debris, water, coal, steel, and steam shooting high above the funnels. What caused this second explosion has been debated for over a century. The coal bunkers were located in the area of impact. Could coal dust have ignited? Had steam lines ruptured, causing a boiler explosion? Or had the munitions in the cargo hold detonated? Each theory has its proponents and technical arguments. What's beyond dispute is that the second explosion was catastrophic. Lusitania immediately began listing to starboard, leaning toward the damaged side. Water poured through the massive openings in her hull. The ship's forward momentum drove water through the breaches with tremendous force. Within minutes, the list reached 15 degrees, then 20, and she was still making way, still moving forward at speed because the turbines were undamaged and took time to stop. Captain Turner, on the bridge, immediately grasped the situation's gravity. He ordered the engines stopped, the watertight doors closed, and the lifeboats prepared. But almost nothing worked as it should. The list made launching lifeboats from the port side nearly impossible. They swung away from the ship's side, dangling uselessly. On the starboard side, the list pressed the boats against the hull. The ship's forward momentum created wind and water flow that made launching boats extremely dangerous. Several boats flipped as they were lowered, spilling occupants into the sea. Others smashed against the ship's side. The crew, many of them inexperienced wartime replacements, struggled to control panicking passengers. There had been no lifeboat drill, a peacetime practice abandoned to save time during the war. Passengers didn't know their assigned stations. Third-class passengers deep in the ship had to navigate unfamiliar corridors and climb multiple decks, the list making walking difficult. Wireless operator Robert Leith managed to send distress calls. "Come at once, big list, 10 miles south Old Head Kinsale." The calls were received. Rescue vessels began heading from Queenstown, but Lusitania was 11 miles offshore. Help would take time. For those aboard, time collapsed into chaos. In first class, Alfred Vanderbilt gave his life jacket to a woman, then helped others into boats. He would not survive. Elbert Hubbard and his wife were last seen standing on deck, arm in arm, making no effort to save themselves, whether from philosophical resignation or simple shock, no one knows. Charles Frohman allegedly quoted from Peter Pan, a play he had produced, "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life." These composed farewells may be myth, embellished in the retelling, but they reflect how people wanted to remember the tragedy, dignity in the face of doom. For many, particularly third-class passengers and crew deep in the ship, there was no dignity, only terror and desperate struggle. Corridors filled with water. Emergency lighting failed. In the darkness, people clawed their way upward, children crying, adults shouting. Some made it to deck, many didn't. Parents faced impossible choices. Some strapped life jackets on children and threw them into the water, hoping they would be picked up. Some mothers clutched infants and jumped together. The water temperature was roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill within an hour or two through hypothermia. 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, at 2:28 p.m., Lusitania's bow touched the seabed 300 feet below. Her stern rose into the air, propellers still visible above the waterline. Then she slid beneath the surface. From U-20's periscope, Schweiger watched the sinking. His war diary entry is remarkable for its emotional flatness. The ship stops immediately and heels over to starboard very quickly, immersing simultaneously at the bow. The name Lusitania becomes visible in golden letters. He noted the large number of people in the water, but made no attempt at rescue, impossible for a submarine anyway, and suicidal given the likelihood of British vessels arriving soon. He ordered U-20 submerged and departed the area. On the surface, survivors clung to wreckage, lifeboats, deck chairs, anything that floated. Some boats had launched successfully and were picking up swimmers. The sea was littered with bodies, living and dead. People called out for loved ones. Children wailed. And slowly, painstakingly, rescue vessels began arriving from Queenstown. The first rescue vessels arrived within an hour, fishing boats, tugs, and eventually the naval patrol yacht Bluebell. They found a scene of horror. Bodies floated everywhere, many still wearing life jackets. Survivors, some barely conscious from hypothermia, were hauled from the water. The rescue operation continued into the evening, boats crisscrossing the debris field, searching for anyone still alive. The rescued were taken to Queenstown, a small Irish port town utterly unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. The population was around 7,000, and suddenly hundreds of shocked, injured, traumatized survivors were arriving. The town mobilized every resource. Hotels, churches, and private homes became temporary hospitals and shelters. Doctors worked through the night treating hypothermia, broken bones, and shock. And the dead arrived too. Bodies were brought ashore and laid in rows at the temporary morgue, a local market hall, for identification. Some were easily identified, their papers intact. Others had to be identified by family members traveling from Britain and America, a process that was agonizing. Some bodies were never identified. Some were never recovered at all, claimed by the sea. The final count was stark. Of the 1,959 people aboard, 1,198 died, including 128 American citizens. Nearly two-thirds of the passengers perished. The crew suffered proportionately worse. They had been deeper in the ship, closer to the explosions, with less time to reach the deck. Of the 139 children aboard, only 35 survived. News of the sinking reached the world with shocking speed. Wireless technology, only a decade old in 1915, ensured that within hours, newspapers in London, New York, Berlin, and beyond were printing extra editions. The reaction was seismic. In Britain, rage and grief combined. This was not a warship sunk in battle, this was a passenger liner torpedoed without warning. The Lusitania was a symbol of British achievement, and 1,198 people, civilians, women, children, were dead. Recruitment offices saw a surge of volunteers. "Remember the Lusitania" became a rallying cry, printed on posters showing the sinking ship with drowning passengers in the water. In America, the reaction was more complex but equally strong. The 128 American dead included prominent citizens: Alfred Vanderbilt, the Hubbards, businessmen and families. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of the European War, faced enormous pressure. Former President Theodore Roosevelt thundered that this was an act of piracy and demanded war. Newspapers across the political spectrum condemned Germany. Even those who had supported American neutrality were shaken. In Germany, the reaction was defensive. Official statements claimed the sinking was justified. Lusitania was carrying munitions, therefore was a legitimate target. Some German newspapers celebrated the sinking as a military victory. Medals were even struck commemorating the event, showing passengers buying tickets on one side and skeletons drowning on the other, with the caption, "No contraband." These medals, intended as satire criticizing British hypocrisy in allowing munitions on passenger ships, backfired spectacularly. British propagandists reproduced them as evidence of German brutality and callousness. The German government also pointed out, with some justification, that they had warned travelers explicitly. The newspaper advertisements had been clear. If Americans chose to travel on British ships through a declared war zone, they bore some responsibility for the consequences. This argument was legally defensible but politically disastrous. It sounded like victim blaming, and it confirmed the image of Germany as ruthlessly indifferent to civilian life. Within weeks, the British government convened an official inquiry under Lord Mersey, a prominent jurist who had previously investigated the Titanic disaster. The inquiry's purpose was ostensibly to determine what happened and whether anyone was culpable. In reality, it was as much about managing public opinion and absolving British authorities of responsibility. Captain Turner was the obvious scapegoat. The inquiry focused on his decisions. Why hadn't he zigzagged? Why had he sailed so close to the coast? Why hadn't he maintained maximum speed? Turner defended himself as best he could. He had been following Admiralty guidelines. He had taken standard precautions. The attack was simply bad luck, but the questioners were relentless. The Admiralty's own role received far less scrutiny. Why hadn't Lusitania been provided an escort? Why were the wireless warnings so vague? Why was Turner not informed that U-20 was specifically operating off the Irish coast? These questions were glossed over. Lord Mersey's report ultimately blamed Turner for negligence, though Cunard refused to dismiss him, instead quietly transferring him to other duties. Years later, Mersey himself expressed private doubts about the inquiry's conclusions, suggesting he had been pressured to protect the Admiralty. Turner would spend the rest of his life defending his reputation. He never spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining a dignified silence until his death in 1933. The question of Lusitania's cargo became politically toxic. The British government insisted the cargo was routine commercial goods. The munitions, the rifle cartridges and shell casings were acknowledged but described as negligible, not enough to pose any danger. Critics, particularly in America and later in Germany, charged that Lusitania had been carrying far more dangerous cargo, high explosives, gun cotton, or other military materials that would explain the catastrophic second explosion. Over the decades, various investigators have examined the manifests, survivor testimony, and other evidence. The current consensus among most historians is that Lusitania was carrying the munitions listed in her manifest, but probably nothing more. The second explosion was most likely caused by coal dust ignition or steam explosions from ruptured boilers. However, the British government's evasiveness about the cargo and the sealing of certain official documents for decades fueled conspiracy theories that persist even today. The legal battles over liability dragged on for years. Survivors and families of victims sued Cunard, the British government, and even sought damages from Germany. Most cases were eventually settled for modest sums. The war itself interrupted and complicated these proceedings. By the time the war ended in 1918, the Lusitania had been overshadowed by so much greater suffering, millions dead in the trenches, entire generations lost, that one shipwreck, however dramatic, seemed almost quaint. The sinking of the Lusitania did not immediately bring America into World War I, but it fundamentally changed American public opinion and put enormous pressure on German policy. President Wilson sent a series of increasingly stern diplomatic notes to Germany demanding an end to unrestricted submarine warfare and reparations for American deaths. Germany, recognizing that pushing America into the war would be strategically catastrophic, eventually backed down. By September 1915, Germany had ordered U-boats to follow the cruiser rules when attacking passenger liners, providing warning and ensuring passenger safety before sinking vessels. This policy shift reduced American casualties and temporarily defused the crisis. But it also meant Germany had effectively abandoned its most effective weapon against British commerce. The blockade of Germany continued, slowly starving the German war effort and civilian population. The tensions created by this asymmetry would eventually lead Germany to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, a decision made with full knowledge it would likely bring America into the war. And indeed it did. America declared war on Germany in April 1917. So the Lusitania's legacy is complex. It didn't trigger immediate American entry, but it began a process that made eventual American involvement far more likely. It created a reservoir of anger toward Germany that could be activated when circumstances demanded. And it demonstrated to Germany that attacking civilian vessels, no matter the military justification, carried profound political costs. In Britain, the Lusitania became a propaganda tool almost immediately. Recruitment posters featured the sinking ship. Patriotic songs and poems invoked her name. The message was clear: this is what German barbarism looks like. Enlist to avenge the innocent dead. Whether this propaganda was cynical or sincere, or both, is perhaps unanswerable. Britain was fighting for survival, and the Lusitania's dead became soldiers in a different kind of war, the war of symbols and narratives. In Germany, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the Lusitania faded from public consciousness. It became an uncomfortable reminder of a decision that had gained little militarily while costing dearly diplomatically. After the war, in the bitter years of defeat and economic collapse, few Germans wanted to revisit the incident. It was easier to forget. Walter Schweiger never faced trial for his actions. Under the laws of war as Germany understood them, he had followed orders and attacked a legitimate target. He continued commanding submarines and was awarded Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite. In September 1917, his U-boat, U-88, struck a mine in the North Sea and sank with all hands. Schweiger was 32 years old. Whether he ever felt remorse for the Lusitania, we cannot know. His personal papers, if they existed, did not survive. For 20 years after the sinking, Lusitania rested undisturbed 300 feet beneath the surface, about 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale. The Irish Sea is cold and murky, and the technology to reach such depths barely existed. She was remembered in memorials, in the memories of survivors, and in history books, but the physical wreck was inaccessible, gradually being claimed by the sea. In 1935, British salvage diver Jim Jarrett located the wreck using primitive sonar equipment. What he found was sobering. The ship lay on her starboard side, the side that had been struck, heavily damaged by both the sinking and 2 decades of decay. Jarrett's work was limited by the technology of the era and by the onset of World War II, which halted most civilian diving operations for years. After World War II, interest in the Lusitania revived periodically. Various salvage operations over the decades recovered artifacts, portholes, deck fittings, personal items belonging to passengers. Each expedition reignited public fascination, but also raised ethical questions. Was this maritime archaeology or grave robbing? The wreck contained human remains. Did the families of the dead have rights? What about historical preservation versus private profit? In 1982, American physician and diving enthusiast Robert Ballard, who would later find the Titanic, led an expedition to the Lusitania using advanced underwater photography. His images revealed a wreck in advanced deterioration. The superstructure had largely collapsed, the wood decking was gone, and fishing nets draped across the debris. The bronze propellers had been salvaged decades earlier. What remained was a rusting steel skeleton, recognizable as a ship, but stripped of the grandeur that had once made her a wonder of the world. Subsequent expeditions in the 1990s and 2000s used remotely operated vehicles and sophisticated sonar mapping to create detailed surveys of the wreck site. These studies confirmed what many had suspected. The ship's starboard side, where the torpedo struck, was massively damaged, blown outward from internal explosions. Whether those explosions were caused by coal dust, boilers, or munitions, cargo remained ambiguous. The evidence was simply too degraded to provide definitive answers. Legal battles over ownership and salvage rights dragged through courts for decades. In the 1960s, an American named John Light had purchased salvage rights from the British War Risks Association and attempted to recover materials from the wreck. His activities were controversial. Some accused him of desecrating a grave site, but he also recovered historical artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. In 1982, the wreck was declared a protected site under Irish law, limiting future salvage operations. Today, the Lusitania lies in approximately 300 feet of water, slowly disintegrating. The Atlantic is not kind to shipwrecks. Cold water, currents, and biological activity all take their toll. Unlike the Titanic, which rests in deep, stable water, the Lusitania is in a dynamic environment where deterioration proceeds relatively quickly. Experts estimate the recognizable structure may collapse completely within the next few decades. Memorials to the Lusitania exist on both sides of the Atlantic. In Liverpool, Cunard's home port, a memorial was erected near the pier head commemorating the dead. In Cobb, Ireland, the town formerly known as Queenstown, a memorial stands in the old cemetery where many victims are buried. In New York, where the ship's final voyage began, plaques and memorials remember the American dead, particularly prominent victims like Alfred Vanderbilt. But perhaps the most poignant memorials are the private ones, the family stories passed down through generations. The woman whose grandmother survived by clinging to debris for 3 hours. The man whose great-uncle, a ship's steward, went down with the vessel. The descendants of those lost who have visited Cobb to stand at Grave or look out at the sea where their ancestors died. The sinking of the Lusitania forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about modern warfare, technology, and the illusion of civilian immunity in total war. The first lesson was about vulnerability. The Edwardian age had been characterized by a faith in progress, a belief that technology made life safer, more comfortable, more predictable. The great liners embodied this confidence. They were cities of steel, seemingly invincible, tamming the Atlantic that had once been so deadly. But a single torpedo from a submarine costing a fraction of the ship's construction price destroyed the Lusitania in 18 minutes. Technology, it turned out, created new vulnerabilities as quickly as it solved old problems. The same engineering that enabled unprecedented size and speed also created catastrophic failure points. The second lesson concerned the erosion of civilian immunity. For centuries, Western warfare had maintained at least the pretense of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. The laws of war codified this distinction. But World War I was total war, entire economies mobilized, entire populations engaged in war production. If a factory worker producing shells was part of the war effort, what about the ship carrying those shells? What about the ship that could carry shells? The Lusitania occupied a gray zone. She was a civilian vessel carrying civilian passengers, but she was also British-owned, had government subsidies that made her available for military conversion, and was carrying munitions cargo. Germany's argument that she was therefore a legitimate target has a certain cold logic. But accepting that logic means accepting that civilians traveling on such vessels forfeit their protection. And if that's true, then almost all civilian travel becomes hazardous in wartime, and the distinction between civilian and combatant collapses entirely. This was the trajectory of 20th-century warfare, from the Lusitania to the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, which deliberately targeted civilian populations, to the nuclear age, where entire cities became potential targets. The Lusitania was an early step on this terrible path. The third lesson was about propaganda and memory. Both sides instrumentalized the tragedy. Britain used it to recruit soldiers and vilify Germany. Germany used it to justify unrestricted submarine warfare and criticize British hypocrisy in using civilian ships for military purposes. The truth, complex, ambiguous, morally uncertain, was less useful than the simplified narratives each side required. This pattern would repeat endlessly. The sinking of the Lusitania was not the last time a tragedy would be shaped by propaganda into a weapon. Over the decades, historians have worked to separate fact from propaganda, to understand what actually happened versus what people believed happened or wanted others to believe. This work continues. As recently as the 1990s and 2000s, new archival research revealed details about British naval operations, German submarine tactics, and the decision-making processes on both sides. Each generation re-examines the Lusitania with new questions and new methodologies. Yet certain fundamental questions remain unresolved. Was Captain Turner negligent, or was he simply unlucky? Could the Admiralty have done more to protect the ship? Did the munitions cargo contribute to the catastrophic second explosion? Should Germany have treated Lusitania differently than other British merchant vessels? These questions have been debated for over a century, and consensus remains elusive. Perhaps in the end, the questions themselves are the legacy. The Lusitania forces us to confront the moral complexity of warfare, the difficulty of assigning blame in chaotic situations, and the tragic consequences when international law breaks down. There are no clean answers, no satisfying conclusions. Captain Turner made decisions that seemed reasonable given his information and experience. Schweiger followed his orders and acted within his understanding of the rules of war. The passengers made rational choices to travel, and 1,198 people died. In the century since the Lusitania sank, the world has changed beyond recognition. The Edwardian age, with its rigid class structures and imperial certainties, is as remote as the ancient world. The British Empire that built the ship no longer exists. Germany, twice defeated in world wars, is now a democratic ally. The transatlantic liners that once carried millions of passengers have been replaced by aircraft. The technology that seemed so advanced in 1915, steam turbines, wireless telegraphy, is museum pieces. Yet the Lusitania endures in cultural memory. She appears in documentaries, historical novels, and scholarly monographs. Diving expeditions to the wreck make headlines. Auction houses sell recovered artifacts for substantial sums. Why does one ship, one tragedy among so many, retain this hold on the imagination? Part of the answer lies in timing. The Lusitania sank at a hinge moment in history between the old world and the new. Between the 19th century's certainties and the 20th century's chaos. She embodies a world ending. Every image of the Edwardian passengers boarding in New York, every account of the luxurious interiors, every detail of the pre-war transatlantic crossing routine reminds us of a way of life destroyed by the war. The people who died on May 7, 1915, were the last generation to inhabit that world fully. They were killed not just by a torpedo, but by historical forces they couldn't control or fully understand. Part of the answer is also the enduring power of ambiguity. Clear-cut stories, obvious villains and heroes, unambiguous right and wrong, are emotionally satisfying but often intellectually shallow. The Lusitania resists easy categorization. Was she a legitimate military target or an innocent civilian vessel? Was her sinking a war crime or a legal act of war? Was Captain Turner negligent or simply unlucky? These questions don't have definitive answers, and that uncertainty makes the story perpetually engaging. Each generation can re-examine the evidence and reach its own conclusions. The Lusitania also speaks to contemporary concerns in ways that remain relevant. We live in an age when the line between civilian and military increasingly blurs, when cyberattacks target infrastructure, when drones strike targets in populated areas, when the concept of a battlefield has become almost meaningless. The questions raised by the Lusitania's sinking about legitimate targets, proportional response, civilian immunity, and the laws of war are still being debated in international courts and military headquarters. The technology changes, but the moral dilemmas remain. For the families of those who died, the Lusitania is not history but memory. Many descendants have traveled to Cobb, Ireland, to visit the grave, to stand at the old head of Kinsale and look out at the sea. Some have dived to the wreck itself, seeking connection with ancestors they never knew. These pilgrimages speak to a deep human need to touch the past, to honor the dead, to maintain continuity across generations. The survivors, those who were pulled from the water on that May afternoon, carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, giving lectures and interviews. Others maintained silence, unable or unwilling to revisit those 18 minutes. They scattered across the world, Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and lived ordinary lives marked by extraordinary memory. The last survivor, Audrey Lawson-Johnston, who had been an infant when the ship sank, died in 2011 at the age of 95. With her death, the Lusitania passed entirely into history. No one alive today remembers the event firsthand. In the quiet waters off the Irish coast, the wreckage of RMS Lusitania continues its slow dissolution. The steel that once formed her hull is returning to the earth from which it came, oxide by oxide, molecule by molecule. The sea that she once conquered now claims her utterly. In another generation or two, the structure will collapse completely, and she will exist only in photographs, in memories, and in the historical record. But her story remains vital because it is fundamentally a human story about people who dreamed of speed and luxury, who built something beautiful and powerful, who made choices with incomplete information, who loved and hoped and died. It is about the gap between confidence and reality, between how we think the world works and how it actually works. It is about the moment when certainty shatters. On June 7, 1906, when Lusitania slid down the ways into the Clyde, she represented humanity's finest achievements. The cheering crowds saw the future, faster, larger, more magnificent. They believed, as the Edwardians did, that progress was inevitable, that civilization advanced always forward, that reason and technology would solve all problems. 9 years later, when she sank off Ireland, those beliefs sank with her. The war that followed, with its trenches, its poison gas, its mechanized slaughter, confirmed that technology could destroy as efficiently as it could create. The 20th century's promise turned out to be equally a threat. The 1,198 people who died when Lusitania sank were not soldiers. They were not killed in battle. They were civilians caught between competing visions of how war should be fought, between old rules and new realities, between national interests they had no voice in shaping. Their deaths changed history, but they had no desire to be historical figures. They simply wanted to cross the Atlantic, for business, for family, for adventure, for 1,000 private reasons that died with them. We remember the Lusitania not because we have answered all the questions she raises, but because those questions remain urgent. How do we protect the innocent in war? Where is the line between legitimate military action and atrocity? Who decides what targets are acceptable? What obligations do nations owe to neutral civilians? How do we assign responsibility when multiple actors make decisions that combine into tragedy? These are not abstract ethical puzzles. They are questions with consequences measured in human lives. The 1,198 people who died on May 7, 1915, deserve to be remembered not as statistics or propaganda tools, but as individuals, each with a name, a story, a network of love and loss. Alfred Vanderbilt helping others into lifeboats, mothers clutching infants, crew members trapped below decks, children calling for parents. The elderly and disabled unable to reach the deck, the strong swimmers who made it to wreckage only to succumb to hypothermia, the fortunate who found space in lifeboats, each one a world extinguished. The Lusitania sailed between two worlds, the confident Edwardian age and the brutal 20th century. She was built for one and destroyed by the other. Her wreck rests between them still, a monument to the moment when innocence ended and the modern age began. In the end, perhaps that is her lasting meaning. She reminds us that the world can change with terrible swiftness, that our certainties are more fragile than we believe, and that the price of historical transformation is paid not by abstractions like nations or governments, but by individuals, people with names and faces, hopes and fears, who boarded a ship on a spring morning in 1915 and never saw the sunset. The Lusitania is gone, but her story of ambition and tragedy, of technology and vulnerability, of the gap between how we wish the world to be and how it actually is, endures. As long as we grapple with these questions, as long as we honor those who died, her memory serves a purpose. And perhaps that is the only consolation for such loss, that we remember, that we learn, and that we refuse to let their deaths be meaningless.